He kneels at a grave that holds no body. Every evening, same time. Same bouquet of white chrysanthemums, fiori per I morti, flowers for the dead in Italy. He whispers apologies to carved granite, to a name, to a lie. His fingers trace the letters like a man reading scripture he no longer believes in. She watches from across the cemetery. Her son's small fist grips the hem of her black dress so tight the fabric pulls. The boy doesn't cry. He never cries. He has his father's eyes, dark, still, cataloging everything. He watches the man kneel in the wet grass and asks the question he always asks. Why does he come here if nobody is buried there? Welcome to Roses and Revolvers, where no one leaves untouched. If this story had your heart racing, you already know you can't stop here. Subscribe now, because the next confession? It's darker. And you won't want to hear about it from someone else. Drop your location in the comments. I want to know who's brave enough to stay. She has no answer that wouldn't unmake him. So she pulls him closer into the shadow of the weeping willow and watches the man she once loved destroy himself over a death that never happened. Salvo Bianchi did not believe in ghosts. And yet he visited one every night. The cemetery outside Naples was not the kind of place ordinary men came to grieve. It was old money wrapped in marble, rows of polished granite and sculpted angels tucked behind iron gates, bordered by cypress trees that had outlived every empire the city had ever served. The kind of place where the dead rested among the powerful, separated from the living by nothing more than a thin curtain of stone and silence. He arrived at 10 p.m. Always 10 p.m. The gates were locked by then, but locks meant nothing to a man who owned half the city's underground. The caretaker, an old Calabrian with a bad leg and worse memories, had learned years ago not to ask questions. Salvo left him an envelope every month, thick enough to keep his granddaughter in her convent school, thick enough to keep his mouth sealed like a confessional. Tonight, the air was weighted with late autumn rain. The kind that didn't fall so much as descend, clinging to skin, to wool, to grief, like guilt made tangible. Salvo walked the familiar path past the mausoleums of shipping magnates and disgraced politicians. Past the carved obelisks of old Camorra families who spent more on their tombs than they ever spent on their sons. Past the humble stones of people the city had already forgotten. And then her name. Veronica Bianchi. Amata. Perduta. Beloved. Lost. He knelt. The wet earth soaked through his suit, Brioni, bespoke, the kind of suit men in his position wore like armor. He didn't notice. He placed the white chrysanthemums against the stone, the way he had placed them every night for 3 years, and let his fingers rest on the carved V of her name. Perdonami, he whispered. Forgive me. He said it every night. He did not expect an answer. 50 yards away, behind a curtain of willow branches and winter fog, Veronica Bianchi pressed her son's face gently against her shoulder so he would not be seen. The boy's breath was warm against her neck. He smelled of the bread she had baked that morning, simple, ordinary, alive. She watched Salvo's shoulders shudder. Just once. Just enough. And she did not move. He had held the order in his hand for 6 minutes before he signed it. He knew because he had counted. 6 minutes of staring at his own name above the word eseguire, execute, while his consigliere, Enzo, stood across the desk with the patience of a man who had delivered death sentences before and would deliver them again. The rain had been the same that night too. Naples in November. It never stopped. The evidence is clean, Enzo had said. She gave Caruso the shipment routes. 17 men, Don Bianchi. 17 of ours, dead because someone opened their mouth. Salvo had not looked up. He had looked at her photograph instead, the one from their wedding, tucked beneath the glass of his desk like a man who still believed beautiful things could survive in ugly worlds. Veronica, laughing at something off camera, unaware she was being watched. She was always laughing then. Before him. Before all of it. He signed. 3 years later, he was still trying to understand how a man could destroy the only good thing he had ever possessed and continue to breathe. Every night at the grave was his answer. You don't continue. You simply haven't stopped yet. He pressed his palm flat against the granite and felt nothing, no warmth, no absolution, no ghost pushing back. Just cold stone and the sound of rain needling the earth around 17 fresh chrysanthemums that would be dead by morning. He almost missed the toy entirely. It was half buried in the soil at the base of the headstone, a small wooden soldier, hand-carved, the paint worn thin from handling. Salvo stared at it for a long moment before he picked it up. His breath left him in a single, silent collapse. He recognized it. He had held an identical one as a boy, carved by his father's hands in a village house that no longer existed. A soldier from a set of 12. A tradition. A Bianchi tradition. No one outside his blood knew about them. Salvo rose slowly, the toy clenched in his fist, and turned to scan the dark tree line beyond the cemetery wall. The fog gave nothing back. But his pulse, steady for 3 years through every war, every betrayal, every body, was suddenly slamming. Someone had been here. Someone who knew things they could not know. Someone who had stood at Veronica's grave and left a message only he would understand. He looked down at the carved soldier one last time, and the thought arrived like a blade between the ribs. What if he had signed the wrong name? She had become very good at disappearing. Veronica Bianchi, who had once worn Valentino to state dinners and slept in 800 thread-count sheets in a villa overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, now woke before dawn in a 2-room flat above a laundromat in the quartiere. Spagnally, her hands already cracked from yesterday's bleach, her son still sleeping in the only bed. She had learned to move quietly, to keep her head down, to answer to the name Elena Russo without flinching. She had learned that survival was mostly about the small performances. The way you nodded at the market vendor. The way you never made eye contact with men in good suits. Luca had learned it too. He was 3 years old, and he had already learned it, and that was the thing that broke her open every night after he fell asleep, that her son's first education had been in how to be invisible. She was folding sheets when she heard the motorcade. 3 black cars. Moving too slowly for traffic, too deliberately for coincidence. Through the laundromat's fogged window, she saw the lead vehicle ease to a stop outside Scuola Primaria San Gennaro, Luca's school, and her hands went completely still. The sheet she was holding dropped to the floor. The rear door of the second car opened. Salvo stepped out. Not near the grave. Not at a distance, blurred by fog and 50 yards of cemetery. Here. 20 meters from where her son sat learning to write his false name in a composition book. Salvo in daylight, in a charcoal suit, speaking quietly to a man she recognized as his head of security, scanning the street with the calm, systematic attention of a man looking for something. Veronica stopped breathing. She had 3 minutes before afternoon dismissal. 3 minutes before 80 children poured through those gates, and among them one boy with his father's jaw, his father's eyes, his father's way of standing like he owned whatever ground he occupied. She was already moving, ripping off her apron, grabbing her keys, when she saw Salvo turn. Not toward her. Toward the school gate. And she realized, with a cold that had nothing to do with November, that he wasn't searching the street at random. He already knew where to look. He came back in the morning. Not at 10 p.m. Not with chrysanthemums. He came back at first light, when the mist still sat low across the graves like a held breath, and he crouched at Veronica's headstone and studied the earth the way a man studies a wound, searching for what made it, how deep it went, whether it was still bleeding. The toy soldier had not been there 3 nights ago. He was certain. Salvo Bianchi had built his empire on certainty, on noticing what others missed, on treating small details like loaded weapons. Someone had come to this grave. Someone had knelt in this exact spot and pushed a carved wooden figure into the soil with deliberate hands. Not a stranger. Never a stranger. He found the old Calabrian gravedigger, Marco, raking leaves near the east wall. The man saw him coming and went the color of the mist. Salvo didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. He simply placed his hand on the old man's shoulder, gently, the way you'd steady someone standing too close to a ledge, and walked him to the groundskeeper's shed, and closed the door. "How long," Salvo said quietly, "has someone else been visiting her grave?" Marco's hands shook around the rake handle. "Don Bianchi." "How long, Marco?" The old man broke in under a minute. "They always did." Not because of what Salvo threatened, he hadn't threatened anything, but because of the silence he left around his questions, the kind of silence that filled itself with every terrible possibility. 14 months. "A woman," Marco said. "Always before dawn. Always alone. Dark hair, medium height, a scarf pulled low." She never spoke. She left flowers, not chrysanthemums, wildflowers, the kind that grew on the hillsides above Pozzolippo, and she always left something small at the base of the stone. A button. A ribbon. Once, a folded square of paper Marco swore he hadn't read. "The paper," Salvo said. "Where is it?" Not a question. Marco reached into his coat with trembling hands and produced a worn envelope, crumpled, refolded, the seal long broken. He'd kept it. Of course he'd kept it. Men like Marco always kept the things that frightened them, as though holding the danger close made it less likely to strike. Salvo opened it. A single line, written in handwriting he would have recognized in the dark, in a burning room, at the bottom of the sea. 3 words only. He signed the wrong man. They came at 2 a.m. Veronica heard them before she saw them, the particular silence of men trying not to make sound, which was itself a sound, if you had spent 3 years sleeping with one ear pressed to the dark. She was off the mattress before the first footstep reached the stairwell. Her hand found Luca's mouth gently, firmly, the way she had practiced. He woke without crying. He never cried. Quiet game, she breathed against his ear. Their code. Their catastrophe drill. She had prepared for this. She had told herself she'd prepared for this. But preparation and the actual sound of a door handle being tested from the outside, slow, deliberate, professional, were 2 entirely different countries. 3 men. She counted by shadow through the gap beneath the door. 3 pairs of feet, spread wide, practiced spacing. Not police. Police knocked. These were men who had been sent with instructions that ended in silence. She pushed Luca into the bathroom, pressed the loose tile behind the cistern, and put the knife into his small hands, the one she'd wrapped in tape so the blade faced away. "You hold it and you don't move," she whispered. "Not for any voice except mine." He looked at her with his father's eyes. Steady. Already somewhere older than 3. Then the door came off its hinges. What happened in the next 90 seconds Veronica would never be able to fully reconstruct, only fragments. The lamp as a weapon, the crack of a wrist breaking under her elbow, the second man's surprise that the woman was not afraid. She had lived inside Salvo Bianchi's world for 4 years. She had watched, and she had learned, and she had decided long before tonight that she would not die quietly in a rented room above a laundromat for a crime she didn't commit. 2 men down. The third had retreated to the stairwell. She grabbed Luca from the bathroom and ran barefoot, one sleeve torn, her son's arms locked around her neck like a vice. Down the back stairs, through the laundromat, into the alley where the November air hit her like a fist. She was 3 steps into the dark when she collided with a wall that breathed. Hands closed around her arms. She pulled back, raised her elbow. Veronica. 1 word. 1 voice. A voice she had spent 3 years trying to forget and never once succeeded. Luca went absolutely still against her shoulder. And then, slowly, the boy turned his head toward the voice, toward the face emerging from shadow, and said the only word he had never been taught but somehow always known. Papa. He brought her back to the grave. Not as a threat, or so he told himself. He brought her because it was the only place he could think clearly, the only coordinates his mind returned to when everything else fractured. He drove with Luca asleep across Veronica's lap in the back seat, 3 of his men flanking outside, and not a single word exchanged for the entire 20 minutes through Naples' hollow 3 a.m. streets. At the cemetery gate, he dismissed the men. That alone cost him something. Salvo Bianchi did not dismiss his protection for anyone. He did it anyway. They stood at her headstone. At the name that was hers and the dates that were lies, and the earth beneath which nothing rested except 3 years of his own ruined faith. The mist was back. It was always back. Tell me, he said. That was all. She told him. All of it, the false evidence, the name she'd uncovered, the man inside his own consiglio who had fed Enzo the intelligence and watched Salvo sign the order and said nothing. She spoke without tears, without apology, the way people speak when they have rehearsed a truth for so long it has calcified into something harder than grief. Salvo listened with his back to her, his hand resting on the granite, his face invisible. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that Luca stirred in her arms and looked up at the man who hadn't moved. He has your hands, Veronica said quietly. He builds things. Stacks them, knocks them down, builds them again. I used to think that was you. Now I think it's just him. Salvo turned. He looked at the boy for a long time, at the jaw, the stillness, the dark eyes that held his gaze without flinching. Something moved across his face that Veronica had not seen there in 4 years. Not power. Not calculation. Ruin. The specific ruin of a man realizing too late what he almost destroyed. He reached out slowly, and Luca, without hesitation, without fear, with the terrifying trust of a child who has been told the truth about who his father is, but never the full cost of it, took his hand. The man who framed her, Salvo said, almost to himself. His name is Enzo. Veronica went cold. I know, he continued, voice dropping to the register he used when outcomes were already decided. He's been running the family in my name for 3 years. He has 16 men, 2 politicians, and a judge. A pause. He also has a file. Everything about you. This address. Luca's school. The grave. Salvo looked at her then, fully, for the first time. He sent those men tonight because I started asking questions. Which means he knows I found the note. The cold became something structural, a cold inside her bones. Then we run, she said. Salvo shook his head. Slowly. Irreversibly. No. He looked down at his son's hand inside his own, and something in him seemed to close like a vault door, not against them, but around them. He expects me to run. He's built the last 3 years counting on the fact that I would choose the crown over everything else. His jaw tightened. I'm going to show him what I choose instead. Veronica searched his face for the man who had signed her death order without watching. She didn't find him. What she found was worse, or better, she couldn't yet tell which, a father who had just declared war on his own empire, with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. In the distance, headlights swept slowly through the cemetery gates. Salvo saw them first. His hand tightened around Luca's, and he looked at Veronica with an expression she had never seen on his face in 4 years of marriage. Fear. He didn't send 3 men, Salvo said quietly. He sent 3 men first.